Why don't we begin with prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this ability to meet together in liberty to discuss your word and your institution of the two kingdoms through which you rule us and in which we participate. And we pray that this is a helpful and lively, but not too lively discussion. And just pray that your Spirit be with us and that this be helpful in the coming days and years. Ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so on short notice, I was asked to do a breakfast Bible study. Done a couple of these in the past. Yes. What was that? It was a month. That's still short notice for me. Takes a couple of weeks to fritter away the time and then sit down and say, I need to get started on this thing. And put together a written thing and then decided to turn it into a slideshow because I liked Mark Jace's pretty pictures. So some things got taken out and this kind of organically grew. But I like this because this is something we studied at Concordia under Dr. Charles Mansky. And I found it to be very helpful as a way of thinking it through. As time has gone on, I've kind of had to take this on for myself and say, where does this stuff come from? He had a tendency to really boil things down to very easy to understand categories, which everybody likes. And then later you're like, okay, I understood the categories and they were simple. Did that come from the Bible? And then you find out, yes, it did, but you find out where you can actually find these things in the Bible, or if somebody says, is that in our confessions? Yes, it's there too. So we're going to see where this stuff comes from, how it fits together. It's kind of like a road trip where I'm going through some common destinations, but I'm taking a little bit of a different route through it. So first picture gets the idea of the two kingdoms. You can probably guess what these are. Anybody know what this is? Coronation crown. I think this is one that was put on Prince Charles, making him King Charles very recently. Though he was already King Charles, but coronated, and then Jesus' crown of thorns. So two very different ways of ruling. But we don't say that one's legitimate and one's illegitimate. One of the reasons we discuss this and have a hard time with this is we're in an American situation that's very similar to what you'd find even in England. This is from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where many of you know this scene. Many of you have seen it 17 or 18 times. Arthur comes up upon these people who are kind of gathering muck, and he says, I am your king, and you get this line. You're not my... Well, okay, I have it here. King Arthur says, I am your king. And the peasant woman says, well, I didn't vote for you. King Arthur, you don't vote for kings. The peasant woman, well, how'd you become king then? Angelic music plays. King Arthur says, the lady of the lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I am your king. Dennis the peasant. Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. Arthur, be quiet! Dennis the peasant. You can't expect to wield supreme power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you. So, anyway.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what that was from.
Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Oh.
So.
I never liked him.
You can minimize some participants. When you just when you express over there, it's minimized. Right there.
Ah, okay. We'll move it up a little bit too.
Yeah. But they're still there. Not that we don't like looking.
So anyway, we're in a situation where there are a lot of American Christians, but then a lot of other people are going to say, well, no, that's all mythology. That's kind of a Middle Ages view of how things go. And we have to wrestle with, how are we going to talk to our neighbors about these things? Do we talk to our neighbors about these things? Or is this a private belief? Or how do we do these things? And I think one of the things that's helpful is this has kind of been worked out. This was already a question at the time of the Reformation and moving forward. They were already wrestling with, what is the basis of our law? Where does this come from? How do we relate to this? And how do our biblical stories relate to how we function as citizens? And are we imposing this upon other people, or what do we do? So, starting points. Want to use a passage from the New Testament, and it does have to deal with the civil law to some degree, but this is also kind of expressing the importance of having a good starting point, because somebody tries to bring up a biblical argument with Jesus, but they're starting from the wrong place, even though they're starting from the Bible. And that's something that we could fall into very easily. So this is, did I give the...
What is it from?
That's a good question. I should have, I have it in here, I believe. Matthew 19, verses 3 to 9, if anybody wants to follow along. So, some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his flesh, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no person is to separate.' They said to him, 'Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?' He said to them, 'Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery.'" So, several things can be found here. One that I think was surprising to me, civil law can be good civil law without commanding the highest good. This was a change in my thinking, because I remember when I was about 18 years old, I took a business law class at nearby Marina High School. And we had our textbook, and they had a page where it was the laws on marriage in the various states. And I knew the first part of what Jesus said about anybody who marries another commits adultery, and I'm thinking, yeah, these laws should really be strict. And so I'm looking, and I can't remember, it might have been like Connecticut and Rhode Island had like the really strict, these are the only grounds on which anybody is allowed to divorce, and I'm thinking, those are good laws, those are biblical laws. And I'm missing the point that, but Moses permitted these other things. In fact, God told him to. And this is because the people weren't going to be able to handle this other thing. And so the civil law was not necessarily reflecting everything that God had intended for marriage to be in the original creation. But he was trying to say, we have to have some way of keeping things from completely falling apart. So we're going to create some level of order here, and this is what people can handle now. And so it's not perfect law, but it's kind of the best thing that they could do at the time, and that was a good thing. So a legislator who takes human weakness into consideration may have divine approval. Another thing, the Pharisees argue from a Bible passage, which seems to support them, but is the wrong starting point. And this leads to this other one, sedis doctrinae. In Lutheran circles, we talk about this thing we call sedis doctrinae, and that's the Latin for seats of doctrine. There are particular places where we would say, these are the natural places we find our doctrines. And in this case, Jesus is saying our seat of doctrine for marriage is, when was marriage instituted? That's going to be Genesis. When God originally established marriage, that's the first passage you want to look at to say, what is this thing? Then you look at these other passages and interpret those in light of the clear one. That's the starting point. If you start from the other passages, you may come to some very different conclusions. And like this, the Pharisees are arguing from Scripture. They do have actual words of Moses. And for a lot of American Christians, you would think, well, what could be better? This is great. It's biblical. Let's get into the Bible. But we're told here, maybe that's not quite enough. It's good, but it's not enough. So sedis doctrinae, there's going to be a good starting point. So when we get into this question of earthly rule, we're going to have to find a good starting point. So what is the origin? Any guesses here?
Well, the first law was don't eat in the tree. That was like a command. Don't eat in this tree.
That's good for commandments, yeah. How about the kind of rule, do we get our government out of that? No. Any other guesses? Okay. Yeah, that's a good guess too. That's a little later. I'm thinking we might even find something a little bit
We
earlier.
didn't hear that.
I didn't hear it.
Oh, 10 Commandments.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people would go, and it's the nice thing about that is we have said that this is very basic, even in Luther's small catechism. It's one of the first things we're going to teach all children to know, where we have like God's rules for how we do things summarized very clearly. So we'd say, is this where human government started, or did we actually have something even earlier than that?
So that's the question. You want to know where civil government started?
Yes.
How about when, at the very beginning of creation, God said to Adam and Eve, rule and subdue the earth?
That's a good one. I hadn't thought of that one, and I think that's going to be humans over the creation and animals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you will get quite a bit of it out of there. You're going to legitimize a lot of human activity out of that one. So that's a good one.
Well, Leviticus has the laws. No? Okay, so we're going back.
So we're going back further because that's just like with the Pharisees. It's like Leviticus is early, but there's earlier. Genesis. Genesis is always a good. This is what I'm going to suggest is if you can ever find it in Genesis, that's a really good thing.
Well, you had Noah, and God was fed up with the people, so there was an expectation that wasn't met, and the judgment came from God
Yeah.
in the form of the rain.
Okay.
So that's kind of, there was an expectation set that wasn't met, and there was consequences. Something before that?
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. Genesis chapter 9. And I don't know if you have Bibles. Okay. Let's open some Bibles. And this is an especially good passage to actually read. Chapter 9. Okay, so this is coming after the flood. Yeah, you got about the right area here. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens and everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning from every beast. I will require it and from man. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. And then here's the key one, 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth and multiply in it. So some of this language kind of harkens back to Genesis, the things that he said to Adam and Eve. So it's almost like he's reestablishing the creation. But you get this thing here that I would say, I kind of thought for myself, maybe this is the establishment of human government, and then looked to see what Luther said, and he pretty much agreed with this. So here's his commentary. But here Jehovah establishes a new law, requiring the murder to be put to death by man, a law unprecedented, because heretofore God had reserved all judgment to himself. When he saw that the world was growing worse and worse, he finally enforced punishment against a wicked world by the flood. Here, however, God bestows a share of his authority upon man, giving him the power of life and death, that thus he may be the avenger of bloodshed. Whoever takes man's life without due warrant, him God subjects, not only to his own judgment, but also to the sword of man. Though God may use man as his instrument in punishing, he is himself still the avenger. Were it not for the divine command, then, it would be no more lawful now to slay a murderer than it was before the flood. 34. This is the source from which spring all civil laws and the laws of nations. If God grants man the power of life and death, he certainly also grants power in matters of lesser importance. Power over property, family, wife, children, servants, and fields. God wills that these things shall be under the control of certain men who are to punish the guilty. So I can see Luther makes very, very...
It's like a big conclusion to draw from.
Yeah, and I'm not sure myself how much of this I'm willing to quite accept, but I'll just say we're going to try and find these things somewhere, and he finds a lot of it here, and this is at least worth wrestling with. Do you think it comes here, or how many of these things do you think are legitimate? I mean, you might say, well, some of the things that the state takes upon himself probably aren't legitimate.
Well,
Yeah.
Because the counter argument could be made
Yeah.
rather than, well, because this major thing is given to man, the blood, death for death,
Yeah,
then all the other things lesser are also given to him. But one could argue, well, no, it's only in the case of this major one that it was given to man,
yeah.
and the other ones aren't. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said it, because I was thinking, I kind of want to question this, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. Because, yeah, I do find this a questionable conclusion. I think this is, in Luther's context, this was so much taken for granted, the absolutism of kings, and this took a long time to shake off. I did a little online course in the Magna Carta and how long in England. It's like in the year 1215, they finally get the king to buckle under the power of some of the nobles. And it took about 300 years. And finally they've established this context where this is unthinkable. And they've had all these English kings, and the king finally realizes, okay, I'm under this. And it took a while, because King John first said, I'm going to sign this and I'm going to ignore it. And then he died like 2 years later. His son becomes king under a regent, like he's too immature, and then they're like, well, how are we going to get people to listen to him? Well, we'll make some concessions. We'll do a limited Magna Carta, and then people started liking the whole Magna Carta. Took a long time. So some years later, they get this king from Scotland who's more used to having the free reign. He hasn't been under the Magna Carta. First thing he does when he comes down is have somebody put to death on the spot. And the English lawyers are like, you can't do that. That's not how these things work. He's like, oh, well, that your Magna Carta is really cute, but we're not going to be doing that anymore. It's like, oh, yes, we are. And so it takes a long time to kind of think this through. But in any case, I think Luther was definitely right for getting this life for life thing out of Genesis 9. And I think this is something I would definitely say how much power over these other things, that's another thing. And I mean, to go really far on this, I think, I'm not sure if you get this automated form mailed out by the DMV where a person didn't even have anything to do with it. It bears the same weight as an authority who's actually standing in front of you, say the cop who actually has the gun at his side and is literally there to protect life. That's where I'm thinking the Romans 13, he bears not the sword or the gun in vain. I'm thinking that I think probably, yeah, I think it applies here. Some other things I'm like, I don't know. That's why I always hate when in our study Bibles they have their subheadings and they've kind of made their conclusions.
Yes.
And it'll say the Christian and the state. And I'm like, well, maybe,
Yeah.
but that's a little broad. How about the Christian and duly constituted authority or something? Not just anything somebody might call that.
Well, I tell a lot of people these days,
Yeah.
in Noah's time, God promised he will never flood the earth again.
Mm-hmm.
Now the earth is so sinful that Jesus is shaking the whole world for Christ. So I say that everywhere I go. You know, we really have to 24/7 focus on Jesus, pray,
Yeah.
minister, no matter where we are, because the world is so crazy, so sinful.
I think St. Paul agrees with you. For he must reign till he puts all of his enemies under his feet. And I think allowing a lot of the evil to just run is actually part of the plan. It looks like he's not doing things and he's really accomplishing a lot more. Okay, so though it's kind of covered, it's primus, usus, legis. We get the primary use of the law from this. We've talked about three uses of the law sometimes, but this is the civil use, and I'd say it is rooted in this Genesis passage. So civil authority is created in the 9th chapter of Genesis. It occurs after the fall. This comes after marriage, which was instituted before the fall. Don't know exactly what to conclude from that, but it's an interesting thing to think about, that marriage precedes the state and is part of God's original intention in a way that civil authority doesn't appear to be. Language of Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man or human blood by man, his blood shall be shed, is echoed when Jesus admonishes Peter, all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Matthew 26:52. I was happy when I saw this parallel because I remember, I think the first time I ever heard this statement, it was probably in one of the Easter time. You're watching one of those Easter specials. I don't know if it's the greatest story ever told or one of the earlier ones, but you hear Jesus yelling this at Peter, and then you're thinking, well, sometimes that happens and sometimes people get away with it. It seems like a partially true prophecy, but I don't think it's a prophecy. I think it's more repeating God's institution from Genesis, and I think that probably makes more sense.
One of the things that kind of falls out from what Jesus said to Peter, Peter may have struck the sword and cut off the ear, but Jesus recognized that it was not the proper thing to do, and what did he do? He healed the ear.
Yeah.
Took the bad action that he saw Peter do,
Yeah.
and fixed it.
Yeah, I mean that, and it's a passage that could be mined for weeks all by itself, just because of the various things that happen there. He does tell them to take their swords, and I think there are a lot of Anabaptists who would say, swords are bad, guns are bad, nobody should have them, we should all be pacifists, all of that is illegitimate, and that's not in the passage. On the other hand, he says, yeah, but there are limits to it, and you overshot the limits. And there's just a lot to mine there. And I think humanity always wants to fall on one side or the other, and I think we have to say, it's a hard thing. It's like just war theory. We're either going to justify all wars or we're going to become pacifists, and Scripture holds us to something very different that's hard to do. And then I said, I suspect this is where St. Paul got his sword language for Romans 13. He does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So I think Jesus had restated the Genesis language using the word sword, and I think Paul carried it on here. So Genesis 9 authorizes this vengeance. Jesus and Paul echo it. Now, a little more on why we think there are two kingdoms. Kingdom of Christ, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting, so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." John 18:36. Okay, so Jesus clearly says that he has a kingdom that is not of this world. If there is a kingdom of this world and his kingdom, then you have two kingdoms. Jesus sees fighting as a defining mark of the earthly kingdom. Old Testament Israel was a kingdom which did fight. By Jesus' definition here, it was an earthly kingdom, even if God fought on its side. And this is the thing that's always hard to do, because we often think if there's some kind of contrast, you're completely dumping the other one in the trash and saying there's nothing legitimate. And that's definitely not happening here, because God was on the side of Old Testament Israel. God had founded it. He gave it their laws. It was part of his plan. You do have the New Testament, which is superior and supersedes it. But when we say that, we're not saying, well, God had nothing to do with that, or he was saying that was a bad idea, or I need a plan B to do things completely better because I had a bad idea in the first place. That's not how that should be thought of. And then Jesus' servants did take swords to the Garden of Gethsemane to defend themselves on Jesus' suggestion. So this was not forbidden. But this was not a way to advance Jesus' kingdom. It was a this worldly defense, legitimate, but they overdid it. So one thing to think of, even in the Garden of Gethsemane, they were members of two kingdoms. They were his servants. As his servants, they're not to fight for him, but they had swords to kind of make it so that they were going to be able to get out of there and then be disciples alive later. Okay, the civil sphere. Took this picture from a current TV program called Jury Duty, which I found very funny because I've been on jury duty and it reminds me of it. Okay, something on this comes from the Augsburg Confession, Article 16, 1530. Article 16 of Civil Affairs. Of civil affairs, they teach that lawful civil ordinances are good works of God, and that it is right for Christians to bear civil office, to sit as judges, to judge matters by the imperial and other existing laws, to award just punishments, to engage in just wars, to serve as soldiers, to make legal contracts, to hold property, to make oath when required by the magistrates, to marry a wife, to be given in marriage. They condemn the Anabaptists who forbid these civil offices to Christians. They condemn also those who do not place evangelical perfection in the fear of God and in faith, but in forsaking civil offices. For the gospel teaches an eternal righteousness of the heart. Meanwhile, it does not destroy the state or the family, but very much requires that they be preserved as ordinances of God, and that charity be practiced in such ordinances. Therefore, Christians are necessarily bound to obey their own magistrates and laws, save only when commanded to sin. For then they ought to obey God rather than men. Acts 5:29. So our key confession makes it clear that Christians may participate in the civil sphere. They're encouraged to do so. The idea that it is more spiritual to shy away from the civil sphere is not supported. And even being a soldier was a valid vocation. Luther had people in his time writing to him about this, so he wrote a tract, Whether Soldiers Too Can Be Saved. And it was soldiers who had asked him about this, and they were really worried. They were like thinking, maybe I need to give up my vocation in the army, and might have been on the verge of doing this. And Luther had to weigh this out and think, what am I getting myself into when I tell them to go ahead and do this? So he said, this is very different from private vengeance. You're not doing this when you kill somebody as a soldier. You're not doing it because you are personally mad at the person and decided to pick a fight. Somebody else decided that this was being done to protect life and property. So it's a public office, and we see this described in Romans 13. And then further, when soldiers came to John the Baptist, you see this kind of thing of, what should we do? And he doesn't say, leave the army. And whenever I've thought of this, I'm thinking, well, he must have been clear in his mind that this had to be okay, even in some strange situations, because I can't imagine that every last thing that they were commanded to do was nice. A lot of those situations had to be, at least in our 21st century context, questionable, but it did keep the peace. And so I think Luther said you have to have a strong conscience. There are limits. You don't want to be doing this under the command of a wicked ruler, but he said you want to put even their actions under the best construction. There's a lot that you can't know. Somebody else has to make a lot of these decisions, and when you can, you want to put it in the best light. There are times where it's like you know it's wrong and you're going to have to just say, I can't do this, I can't take this order, it's a wicked order. But there are going to be other times where you're going to have to say, I'm going to leave it to him, and God's called me to this. I wasn't told to leave the army, and so go ahead and do it with a happy conscience, and you'll be a more effective soldier if you do have a good conscience. If you're having to question everything all the time, you're not going to be able to do your job. You wouldn't have anybody in that job at all. Okay. Now, any questions up to this point? Kind of want to have these as discussion points for.
I think it's
Yeah.
becoming very clear how our founding fathers, what they knew and how they set up our government. A lot of people don't realize they were Christians. And
Okay.
that they were, religious people.
Well, I think many of them were. This is something every time I step into it, with even one of them, I'll come to a slightly different conclusion. And I think even some of them, it's hardest on the ones I know the best. It's not even just ignorance that's the problem. I'll be reading John Adams and John and his wife Abigail, and it's so hard to know, partly because church attendance is not the best guide. It's not like everybody who became a deist went to Unitarian church back in the 18th century. They'd be still going to their congregational parish or their Anglican parish, and it's just their pastor or priest had gone over to the other liberal theology and started teaching something different. But they're still going to the church of their youth. But I'll find Abigail Adams saying that somebody, so-and-so, knew who their Savior was. And or she's not sure about Thomas Jefferson because he's a deist. It's like, well, maybe you're not a deist. I'm happy to hear this. Anyway, it's hard to tell.
Rick?
Yes?
Talk for just a moment about the distinction between a Christian being in a position of judgment over the law versus deciding whether to obey the law.
Maybe you'll have to describe that a little bit yourself before I know where you're headed.
Okay, briefly.
Yeah.
If a Christian puts himself or herself in judgment over the law, they say that's a bad law and nobody should obey it. That's different from a matter of Christian conscience saying whether or not I can obey it.
I think there could be cases where that's true. I mean, I can think of extremes where somebody just starts telling you to commit genocide, in which case I do think we are supposed to use our own judgment. Do you have a sample case where you would see a difference?
Not at this time.
Okay. Yeah, I can't immediately come up with something. I know that there are a lot of cases where we're not exactly sure. I mean, I think of a Supreme Court justice is often has the job of saying what the law is rather than whether a law is good or not. And I understand that as a vocation, and they don't feel like their job is to set everything right, but to just say, what is the clear understanding of the agreements we've come to? So I think there are some distinctions to be made, but I think when it comes to our own personal consciences and what we can do, I think we are often looking at divine laws like thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal. And some of those are so absolute, they end up being pretty clear. But there are so many different questions that we can get into here. So the devil's always in the details.
Yeah, we're like, when do you rebel against your government? Going back to
His original question.
yeah,
Yeah,
like in the revolution, our own revolution.
yeah.
I mean, Britain wasn't that bad. But you,
That one, yeah, that one could be a whole series.
we can do all
And I've flip-flopped on that one, and one of the ones I kind of liked was Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. He was the father of American Lutheranism not in the Missouri Synod stream, but in the earlier stream of Germans who came over. And he had some notes in his journal on this, and I could totally tell he's on the colonist side, but he kind of played it as if, well, whether we should be doing this or whether we should be allowing them to take everything that they haven't earned by their own sweat, who could tell? But he does say a lot of this, as a private citizen, you're not always able to know who's best. And so I think his way of figuring it out might have had to do with who's ruling the state where you're in. Like, I think he might have been a loyalist in New York and a revolutionary in Pennsylvania just based on who was literally over him. And that's a different way of thinking about it than a lot of people have. And that's what I'm always finding in our tradition is just when I think I have it mastered, there's another thing to look at, another question you can bring to the thing. And then I think, well, then you have, even with that, you could say, well, they haven't taken over New York yet. I'm a revolutionary until they take this house. I don't know. It's
almost a rhetorical question.
Oh, I know. Yeah. And it's like we can go over these hypotheticals, and you wouldn't know until you're in the situation what you'd actually do. So anyway, here's one where resistance is the question. At the time of the Reformation, this became a very real question. They've done their theory, they've done some of the stuff in the Augsburg Confession, and now you have people who actually want to exterminate the Reformation, or exterminate the Lutheran heresy, even if they want to let Lutherans live as Catholics. We are in receipt of a memorandum from which we learn that the doctors of law have come to an agreement on the question, in what situations may one resist the government? Since this possibility has now been established by these doctors and experts in the law, and since we certainly are in the kind of situation in which, as they show, resistance to the government is permissible, and since, rather, we have always taught that one must acknowledge civil laws, submit to them, and respect their authority, inasmuch as the gospel does not militate against civil laws, we cannot invalidate from Scripture the right of men to defend themselves, even against the emperor in person or anyone acting in his name. In previously teaching that resistance to governmental authorities is altogether forbidden, we were unaware that this right has been granted by the government's own laws, which we have diligently taught are to be obeyed at all times. So often the Lutheran two-kingdom theory is presented in a very cartoony fashion, as if Luther was always a conservative and always forbade resistance. And here's an example. I mean, he was one of the signers of the memorandum saying, our previous teaching was wrong. I've been convinced by the lawyers that I've been misreading this, and that in our own laws, they suggest that there is a valid right to do this kind of resistance. So often the law itself gives you some way of fighting, but you're fighting within it. You're not kind of making yourself your own compound and saying, I'm declaring the republic of myself and my best friend over here, and we're going to run things our way, the way we think things should always have run. You're going to be trying to find some kind of duly constituted authority that's probably already existed. Somebody had already set it up, and you're kind of trying to conserve something maybe better than the current state has been doing. And that's the idea. Hard to do, hard to know, and I think in many cases you're probably going to wonder, am I doing the right thing? You're not sure if you should do it, you're not sure if you shouldn't, but I think it always is going to be that kind of thing where you're looking for something that already exists and appealing to the lesser magistrate or some lower level of power or some law. Yeah?
So does Luther discuss in the memorandum in what situations it is permissible, or to discuss the type of distinction that's being made?
I don't think I think this was pretty short. My picture is actually not of the memorandum. This was actually a picture of a treaty of the Small Chaldaic League that I think came out of this same situation, I think, basically. But all the people who were going to militarily defend the Reformation. But I think we have little hints here, the government's own laws. And so you think you're looking for something existing. It could be laws, or it could be other authorities who have been put in place. Because I've heard of the appeal to the lesser magistrate. So sometimes you might have a mayor or a governor who says, this has gone awry, and I'm releasing you from obedience to so-and-so. And you still have to weigh out, is this legitimate? Are we going to end up in more trouble if we do this? But it's a way of kind of working through that's better than me and my best friend in our compound. So, yeah.
What I understood the first question to be was that even if you're fairly certain for yourself whether you should be convincing others that this is the way we should go.
I think that's going to be on a sliding scale depending on how clearly laws are being violated and what you think the prospects are of regaining ground. Does that make sense?
Well, I heard what you said. I understood what you said.
Yeah, I think it's one of these areas where any given question could be the subject of weeks of discussion. I'm trying to kind of give the sorts of background questions that we can bring to it and the tools that we have within our tradition to look at it. And they're often more than we think, because I think the Lutheran tradition especially is often, like I said, taken in a very cartoon fashion as if they're only saying you must obey under any circumstances. In fact, during the Nazi regime, I remember in high school reading Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, And when they came to arrest the family for hiding the Jews, the German Nazi soldiers were actually quoting Romans 13 at the family. And I like that her dad, when asked, what does the Bible say about governing authorities? And he answers with, honor the king. He's not going to be like shoved into a dead end. But we do have more that we can appeal to here.
Is there any cases where the church should make a stand about a law that they feel is, I'll use the word evil?
We do all the time. We do all the time. We do all the time. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has taken a stand against abortion. That's general, because of thou shalt not kill.
Right, I understand that.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't seem like it's expressed enough in the public.
Yes, well, that's easily explained because there's a lot of people who want abortions.
Who what?
Who want abortions. So public sentiment is against that proclamation, and so is the government. So
I also just got a new news thing, and it, among other, it collects news from all sorts of sources, and then it says which ones are conservative, which ones are liberal, and which ones are centrist. And it'll tell you which news items are left out by either side.
Yes.
And you get a lot of both. It's really interesting.
absolutely.
Both sides have a tendency to distort it, but it's like, even if people are making the case, you might not hear about it just because they decided news blackout.
Wait, Rick, what's the link, or what was the website that compared those?
I just put it on yesterday. I'm not sure if I can.
It's like a paid-for service, right, Rick?
Ground News.
Ground News?
Yeah, it is paid for. It's, I think, it's less than a lot of news subscriptions would be. I mean, you can do, I think, a cheaper one for like $9.99 a year. And it goes up depending on how much control you want of what kind of content you want to tailor it and all that kind of stuff.
And it has
I thought it'd be fun.
a lot of different sources
Yeah,
that are quoted in it too. It's something that I was gonna look at.
yeah.
It's
Oh, okay.
a good, maybe, overall source of news.
Yeah. Okay, so another resistance. I don't know if you know this resistor. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Okay, and then this is just one example of somebody in a tough situation where he's found a number of men who realize that there's something wrong with how they're training pastors. And they are willing to, instead of going into the German university system where they've generally been trained, go to an outlaw training facility to learn to be pastors. They probably don't have the same state support that they would have had. They probably don't have the promise that they're even going to be pastoral positions or paid pastoral positions when they come out of it. So these are people who are willing to sacrifice to be part of this. So this isn't your run-of-the-mill collaborator. But he's still kind of surprised at what happens at this point in the war. So the new law affecting military service went into effect on 1st of May, 1935. In a ceremony in Tempelhof Field in Berlin, in the midst of an unseasonable blizzard, Hitler proclaimed Germany's rebirth as a military power. The Ordnands at Zinks listened with excitement to his speech on the radio, wondering when it would be their turn to put on the uniform. Most of them looked forward to it, unaware of their directors, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's feelings on the subject. At the time, there was widespread desire in the confessing church to provide as many commissioned reservists from its own ranks as possible, and the church's sympathizers and the state bureaucracy agreed with this. To some degree, it showed a genuine desire to participate, but there was also a calculated desire to prove that the church opposition was truly patriotic, reliable, and honorable. Should have been honorable, despite its detractors in the party and the German Christians. The status of officer still enjoyed undiminished respect. It just shows how your current context can still grab even the people who are willing to think outside of it to some degree. And then Bonhoeffer himself, I think, was a pacifist. So he's thinking outside of it, but he's taken maybe another position that probably isn't the best. But at least he gave him some way of standing outside of it. Anyway, this is one little chapter in the Lutheran struggle to try and figure this out. He had to do further thinking on this. Okay, another piece I ran into that I hadn't really thought of too much, though. Uwe Simon Netto had talked about this once. Great men and heroes. Luther believed that history is made and changed by great men and heroes. These heroes who bring about the changes in history are the revolutionary antithesis to Luther's basically conservative political thesis. Acting under the influence of special divine guidance, these men are used by God to bring about the necessary changes of the existing political and social conditions. They are the means which God uses to change the concrete expression the natural orders find in any specific historical situation. God, who guides their hearts and gives them courage, also gives success to the work of their hands. It's quoted from George Farrell, Faith Active in Love, an investigation into the principles underlying Luther's social ethics. His main point here was Luther had yet another piece that fit into the whole system, and just when you think it's all going in one direction, he'd be, oh no, things can change here. You have one of these great people who can bring about the changes. He has so many skills by God that he's going to be able to bring out the changes, and you're not going to see all the bloodshed that you'd see or whatever bad thing. He's going to be able to convince people to follow him, and this is going to be better.
Also kind of a frightening thought.
It is. There's another thing on. I am not going to.
Divine
Yeah,
guidance.
yeah. I will not put this at the same level as Genesis 9:6. This is on the level of opinion.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one.
But it's an interesting one.
Indeed, plenty of examples in history
Yeah.
that would affirm that. But you know, as a Lutheran, how do we stand? We stand on Scripture,
Right.
right? Not on people in our time who are given special divine guidance. Okay, so you want to test something. It says in the Bible, test the spirits.
Yeah.
How do you do that? You go to the Bible.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I mean, and Luther did.
which is divine guidance. Of course, yes. Thank you for stating.
And
what I assume is
yeah,
obvious.
yeah, and Luther did run into the cases where somebody would have claimed to be this kind of hero. In his own time, it was the Münster Rebellion. Thomas Münzer
Yes.
takes over a town. He says, we want to just show people that Christians have some military power, so wear your swords. We're not going to use them. And then he gets them up to the town, and then suddenly he has a new inspiration, supposedly from the Spirit, and they draw the swords and take the town, and all the laws get thrown out. They've done free love and no marriage, and everything's just chaotic and crazy. The rebellion was finally put down by a combined army of Lutheran and Catholics, and you think, what kind of craziness must it have been to get those two fighting on the same side? So he's just like, yeah, that's what we call Schwärmerei, where people think that they're getting direct revelations. And so the direct revelation idea has no part in any of this great men and heroes idea. I will at least say that much. And my main thing was not so much that I think this is a necessary idea as there was always one more piece to Luther's thinking where you can't just say this is, I was talking to Dan earlier, there was a virtue ethicist, Rosalind Hursthouse, who said, it's probably not an advantage to your ethical theory if the entire thing could be mastered by a bright adolescent over a weekend. Where after they've just gotten the pieces of the system, they know the answer to how you do everything. And this is just an example of, there might be one more piece. I don't know if this is a good piece, but there might be one more piece. And then this is his example of one of the guys. And this was Charles the Bold. think Prince Charles was named after him. Looks a little bit like him. A certain nobleman took an enemy prisoner. The prisoner's wife came to ransom her husband. The nobleman promised to give back the husband on condition that she would lie with him. The woman was virtuous, yet wished to set her husband free. So she goes back and asks her husband whether she should do this thing in order to set him free. The husband wished to be set free and to save his life, so he gives his wife permission. After the nobleman had laid with the wife, he had the husband beheaded the next day and gave him to her as a corpse. She laid the whole case before Duke Charles. He summoned the nobleman and commanded him to marry the woman. When the wedding day was over, he had the nobleman beheaded and gave the woman possession of his
I
property
think there's justice.
and restored her to honor. Thus he punished the crime in a princely way. Observe, no pope, no jurist, no law book could have given him such a decision. It sprang from untrammeled reason, above the law in all the books, and is so excellent that everyone must approve of it and find the justice of it written in his own heart.
There you go, it's the justice of Solomon.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, Solomonic. Quoted in Eric W. Gritch, Martin, God's Court Jester, Luther in retrospect. So he's relying more on reason than on special providences or on Schwärmerei. Direct revolution.
I could have predicted
Not
what the
revelations.
guy was up to as soon as
Yeah.
he made that proposition.
Anyway. What now? And there's Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith goes to Washington. How do we fix this mess? A Christian participates in both spheres. We're not just members of the kingdom of grace as baptized people. We could become jurists. We could run for office. We may vote. We may persuade our friends to vote, whether Christian or non. When engaging your non-Christian neighbor, try to use reason and persuasion. This is my professor, Os Guinness. He was the great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the brewer of Guinness Brewery. I went out after one of our seminary would fly Os Guinness in to do his lectures. I think it was like maybe Tuesday night and Wednesday morning or sometime midweek. So after one of these long sessions, they're trying to get as much out of him as possible. Went out to the tavern with a friend, a couple of friends, and we're drinking, and then I notice Oz is at the next table. And I overhear him talking about American beer with other guys from seminary, and I just hear the words, piss water. It's like, that's what the Guinness guys think of American beer.
It's mutual.
Anyway, he definitely was pushing the idea that we need to be using more persuasion. And this was 34 years ago, I calculated. He was watching what was happening with Operation Rescue in Boston specifically. No, actually, he liked the group that was local. But he said nationally they were kind of making a mess on stage, and the only good thing was the National Organization of Women was making a bigger mess in public. But he said he thought the public was going to say a pox in both your houses and stop listening to anybody. And he said because they weren't using persuasion, they were just trying to shout down each other. Right. And so he really liked, I think it was the New England Christian Action Council had renamed themselves the Ethics of Choice Foundation, saying, okay, we're going to talk about choice if you want to talk about choice. And they just started thinking through rhetorically, how do you appeal to people? And so they started, their signs said things like, you have the power to choose life.
Right.
And they said, they'd carry those signs in. The other ones, people would have like this reaction. It's like they were so judgmental. It's like, no, I'm not. And then they'd see these and it's like, well, how do you react against that? No, I'm powerless. Wait, I'm not supposed to say that. I'm a feminist. Anyway, it was an interesting thing, just how if we get onto the persuasion thing, there's a little more that we have. We're trying to use reason. We have that in common. While we do have biblical law, most of what we're going for with not killing, not stealing, et cetera, we can ground in reason. There are some limits to it. We can't go as far probably on the abortion thing as we would if we could rely on special revelation. You can go much further, But you can go fairly far.
Yes.
And you could probably, I've seen a website, it was Libertarians for Life, where the woman was actually an atheist who ran the site.
Right?
And she said it was,
There's several of them.
yeah, Nathaniel Branden and Ayn Rand's teaching. She said, well, when I took that seriously, I had to just say, this is human life objectively, and following the non-aggression principle, yeah, we can't take it. But good for you. So,
Yeah, there's a lot
Yeah.
of nuance to the argument, and anybody who doesn't acknowledge that is probably a radical.
Mm-hmm.
And logic and reason will get a lot farther than sloganeering and reviling.
yeah,
There's good arguments that you can use to convince people. I like the Polaroid snapshot argument. Have you ever heard that one?
I'm not sure what.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
So the question is, when does it become life that needs to be defended in the womb? You know, is it when the first two cells unite? And, you know, so many of those are die anyway. It's not like every fertilized cell becomes a baby. And so part of the natural process is weeding it out. So when does it become defendable as a life? And so in the Polaroid argument, you have somebody who's on come on, I know I'm getting old, but what do you call it when you go into the jungle on a tour to see stuff? Safari, thank you. Gosh, you know you're getting older when you can't come up with those words.
It's the phones they call it.
Yeah. So, they're on a safari, and of course now I have to explain what a Polaroid is. But you used to, you guys are all older, maybe your kids don't know. And you take the picture, and it would come out, and it would just be black, and you wait there for 60 seconds, and slowly the picture comes to clarity, and it becomes a full color picture, and it's beautiful. So you take a picture, you get this perfect picture. Here's a lion leaping after the deer, and you catch it right in midair. And and the thing goes buzz, and it spits out the thing, and it's in its all black stage, and your friend next to you takes it out, looks at it, rips it up, throws it away. There's nothing there. Yeah, there is something there. It was there all the time, but it took time to develop. And this is what an embryo is like in the womb. And so you can say it's just a lump of cells, but you just haven't waited long enough. So there's a logical argument to use to talk to people rather than just saying you're a baby killer, which probably won't convince them because they're going to defend themselves from that attack. So anyway, I think that kind of has to do with what you're saying.
Yeah, it does. Some of this just has to do with thinking, what are good starting points? There are a lot of things that are true to say that are not the best starting points. But then maybe some of them are still good to say at different points. I've known other cases where, an evangelism case where the woman was telling how she got evangelized. And she had heard a case, it was like the gospel, some good apologetics. She was convinced it was probably true. And then she said, but I just don't see what impact it has on my life. And her friend from InterVarsity was just said, Margaret, you're going to hell, and walked off frustrated. And she said, and I sat there and I was miserable. And I thought, Margaret, you are miserable. Nothing could make you more miserable right now, not even becoming a Christian. So she became a Christian. Wow. She said she talked to her friend after that, and her friend thought, I've blown this forever. I never should have gotten upset or whatever. So you can't always tell, but I think thinking through what's good, persuasion, in the public sphere is good, and it's going to vary person to person.
God always has his hands in it.
Yeah. Another point. Remember Israel, God gave a hard-hearted people imperfect laws. We may be dealing with the same. We want to improve them. This may take time. And when the civil sphere looks hopeless, remember that is not your ultimate hope. I know in the early church, they couldn't have imagined that Roman society was their ultimate hope. they could not have made that mistake. I think we're kind of in the privileged position of being able to make that mistake. It doesn't look privileged because it's so much worse than it was when we were growing up. We've seen such a decline in our lives that we just think, this is getting darker and darker. How could it be this bad? But it's still better than so much of Christian history. I mean, that we're sitting here feeling safe and like nobody's going to come in and carry us off today, anyway.
Nobody's
And
burning Christians at the stake for lampposts.
yeah. So have the sense of perspective. It's hard, but the long perspective I think is helpful. So anyway, any questions or comments?
Well, when you're saying that last one there, the civil sphere looks hopeless, it's not our ultimate goal.
Yeah.
It made me think of two things. A lot of times when I see stuff going on, I'm thinking, I'm glad I'm old. I won't have to see.
I've never heard you say that before.
That's not true, and you know that.
Constant refrain. Well, I'm glad I won't be alive to see it.
When it's hopeless, I mean, there's still some action you should take, I would think.
Oh yeah.
There's
Yeah, I'm thinking more attitude.
sides of
Yeah.
of the coin,
Yeah.
Right? So you realize that heaven is our home, but you still live here, and you ought to be involved in it.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to have both. Otherwise, again, you become an extremist if you don't see both sides of the question.
Yeah, it was interesting on the Bonhoeffer biography, and I have a love-hate relationship with him, but
Me too.
it was interesting, even in his last days, he was kind of hoping that he was going to live through the end of the war. And it looked like he might. I mean, they came so close. It's like the American bombing is coming in. It looks like he's going to get out of it. He's imagining being able to lead the German church afterwards. But he had that, it's like so many times where he's like, well, I have to walk away from the seminary, but I'll have to reinvent myself and have a different place. And he ends up in actually military intelligence of all things, but trying to fight a good fight. A couple of assassination attempts against Hitler. One of them came very close. I remember seeing one of these shows where they recreate the thing, where they make a bunker just like it. They put the dummy in, they put the explosives, they set the timer, they do all this, and they show you the room afterwards, and you're like, wow, I did not realize it came that close. And then you read the accounts, and that came very close. He got blown back, and it was an amazing thing. I think he was kind of giddy afterwards, but I think it's because he had survived such an ordeal. Anyway, but I think in some cases it is that kind of long perspective that made this possible for him to keep fighting. Whether or not every single decision was a right one, and that's the thing is I don't think we can really know. We know things he didn't know. He knows things we don't know and we'll never know. And we're tasked to do our lives and try and do them as well as possible and keep the hope that ultimately our King has put us into this situation. God has shut up all men under disobedience so that he might have mercy on all. So even where things are looking bad, a lot of that has a redemptive plan to it. And there you go. Any last thoughts?
Rick, you got I'm curious because there was a Lutheran Witness article on this a while back, and I was interested in it because I've never heard a discussion on it with the two kingdom in relation to the American context of, say, the Civil War. And looking at the different Lutheran churches taking positions on whether to engage or engage with the government or against the government during the Civil War times. So I'm wondering if you've ever come across any good references, or because the Witness article was tiny, and I was like, oh, this just whets my interest in it.
Right.
It didn't really give me any help to go deeper.
I'm a little bit afraid of what I might find if I dig in on that one.
I was very upset with the Witness article.
Yeah.
The Witness article kind of just said, oh yeah, just don't.
I think there was a tendency for Walther to accept slavery as a permanent aspect of human existence. And from what we've seen, it got we got rid of it. And
It
at
still
least
is in the world.
yeah, it is in the world, but I mean, large portions of the West have gotten rid of it. And I think we're the better for it.
I'm curious, but theoretically, so
Yeah.
as a philosopher,
Yeah.
theoretically, not necessarily practically.
Yeah.
Because we always go back to Luther, but as you say, that was such a different context. We're not living under kings, and like understanding two kingdom in the democracy in a republic.
Thank you.
I have so many. I don't know how.
Well, I mean, like when I've gone through my slides, I have to make a distinction between the ones I'm going to put a lot of weight on, Genesis 9:6,
Right.
and then it's going to be that first paragraph where it's taking life for life, and a lot less that one about, and of course, the lesser follows from the greater. And you're like, let me disagree with you on that one. There are pieces of this that bear more weight than others. Others, maybe they're persuasive when we're talking in a Lutheran circles of, well, you know, Luther had these other things that he appealed to too, so don't be so insistent on just ramming that one principle to the nth degree. And so that's kind of what I'm saying is we have some basic ones that we go to, and I think I'm worried if something basic like the Genesis 9:6, life for life, gets lost on some abstruse principle that nobody's ever heard of that you can only find in one monograph. And that's what I'm afraid of, because it's like Genesis 9:6 covers so much of slavery. It's like you can't, half the people die on the ships on the way over. You can't do this. You can't defend it on any grounds. It's going to involve murder, let alone stealing and any other number of things. So, yeah, I think the basic ones are so clear that I don't even want to go further. So
theoretically, but then practically, it's a mess.
Yeah, it is.
How that's going to play out.
Yeah,
I believe in the power of prayers in all situations.
yeah,
We really need to pray in all situations. Because going back to when the mother is pregnant, you know, and she already have kids, which had happened in my family line. My great grandmother, she died when she had
yeah,
the number 4 child.
yeah,
And then number 4 child, always my uncle. He always blamed himself all his life. He was the cause of his mother's death when he was born. So we really need to pray for Jesus to intervene in all situations.
yeah,
We don't know. We don't know. So this old uncle, all his life blaming himself. He's the cause of his mother's death.
This is ironic because he didn't make a decision as a baby
The
that he
doctor
wanted to be born and that his mother was going to die. So logically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the other thing is that confession and absolution in the church is built just for that situation, where you come and say, "Look, you know, Pastor, this has troubled me for years and years," and that's where our freedom comes from.
Yeah.
Our freedom comes from the fact that God promises that He will forgive you. We say it every single service, right? We say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just to forgive our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And this is what people with retained sins and guilt need to come and receive that. And I feel bad for your uncle that he didn't have
I was too young,
a
but
spiritual
I'm
guide.
always hearing it, you know.
Shepherd. Yeah. No, I believe that. He's not the only one.
yeah.
There's a lot of people that have that.
Yeah, your point on prayer, the other thing that points out is when I bring up the civil sphere, when we're in an optimistic mood, we're going to be thinking, all right, let's get down to strategy. What are we going to do? And after you've gone through a few of these, you're like, we need to pray because this is just overwhelming. And it's like, even if we win this one, there are these 5 others that have cropped up that are bigger. And I don't think the winnings are even going to make me feel any better. And I think that's where we have to, it's going to take prayer or we're not going to get through it. So. All right. Well, thank you for joining me. Oh.
That was great, Brad.
Oh, thanks. Let me. Okay.